My sight, which was never good, began seriously packing up in 1980 when I went blind in my right eye as a result of a retinal detachment. After 2 unsuccessful operations, the left retina also detached. And from that moment on, I knew that total blindness was a real possibility. In the following years, I had many operations on my left eye, always leaving me with less sight. And after each operation and convalescence, and sometimes with considerable difficulty, I returned to painting, seeing less well and having to find new ways of doing it. In 1990, which was the year that we moved to Suffolk from London, I stopped painting from direct observation and started painting from short-term memory, aided by tape recordings, which I made while I was looking at the subject. In order to see clearly anything, I had to use a little monocular, which Moorfield Eye Hospital had given me. But as with magnifying instruments, it had a very small field of view and a reduced light level. Whereas my subjects were, and had been for many years, extremely wide-angle views. So I experienced my subject in 2 ways. The whole subject, more or less, with my unaided eye, and bits of it at a time by looking through the monocular. And I panned about the subject a lot, looking through the monocular. Now, this sort of worked all right. And then, sometime later that year, I had nearly finished a painting, another big picture, but there was a place in the middle where I wanted to lower the skyline slightly. And I kept on trying to do this and getting it wrong. And eventually, in desperation, I got more sky colour on my brush. And I went up to the canvas and I looked through my little monocular at the end of my brush and at the place on the canvas. And I put the paint exactly where I wanted it to go. And then fatally, I started looking elsewhere on the canvas through the monocular. And what I saw was amazing. And I wanted to repaint the whole picture looking through the monocular. But luckily, I stopped myself from doing this because I was pleased with the picture and I thought I'd finished it. But then, at some stage in this next picture, which I started in the same way as the first one you saw, I did begin looking through the monocular and painting bits in that way. And I started also to look through the monocular and mix paint on my palette, seeing it like that. And this way of working, which became my normal practice, was quite literally a pain in the neck and something I haven't ever recovered from. Before using the monocular in this way, the way I had painted had been to draw over my paint with a pencil or with a stick of graphite. This sort of enabled me in my imagination to move very freely through the space I was trying to explore and literally to move all over the canvas without actually interfering with the coloured structure of the picture too much. Then in the next picture, almost at once, I started painting entirely in this neck-aching way of peering at the canvas through the monocular and at the palette through the monocular. But in order to work like this, I had to find a new way of drawing, because I could only ever see a small bit of the canvas at a time. And so I began measuring in a fairly crude sort of way and marking reference points on the canvas with marks made with oil pastel. When I had been a student at Camberwell in the 60s, I had had for a time as my tutor Ewan Uglow, and I had spent a good long time during that time at Camberwell practicing painting using a sort of measurement which I had long abandoned, but which came back to help me now that I had to find this new way of drawing. I carried on painting like this for a while. Then in the summer of 1994, we were in Italy, staying with some friends north of Rome, and I was painting gouaches directly from the subject in the blinding sunlight, which I loved. And when I got back to Suffolk, I didn't like the English light very much. It seemed dark and uncoloured, and the shadows seemed very black. And I realised I wanted to go on painting Italian light. And I wondered whether I might be able to make large oils of the subjects which I had been trying to paint in Italy. And this went surprisingly well. And then, in one of the last pictures I started, there was something about the geometry of the square and the lie of the land that I simply couldn't understand or remember. And I just didn't have the information I needed. And I started asking the family whether anybody had taken photographs of it. And the only person it turned out who had was my wife's brother Patrick, who had visited us there for a couple of days, but who lived in Japan. Anyway, I got in touch with Patrick and he sent me his prints, and a couple of them, although they weren't taken from quite the right place, did throw vital light on what was troubling me, which was notably that it wasn't a square at all, it was a triangle. I realised then that this was how I wanted to work. I wanted to go to somewhere exciting, where the sunlight was very bright. Now, I've got to digress a bit here because there's something I've left out. I don't think it's going to upset the order of images. But in order to work looking through the telescope, because as I said earlier, telescopes reduce the light level, I needed very bright light to paint by and to see my palette by. And so I painted wherever I could outdoors in direct sunlight. And then I got banks of conservation quality daylight tubes in my studio, loads and loads and loads of them, which raised the light level there to something approaching sunlight so I could work indoors. Right, back to this new way of proceeding. The idea would be to go to somewhere exciting where the light was strong. Paint gouaches in front of nature as best I could. Make tape recordings, soak up the subject, and get somebody to make a sort of photo mosaic of my subject, because my subjects were still very wide-angle views. I painted wide-angle views because this was really what I was aware of whenever I was somewhere. You know, my general sort of experience of being somewhere was of a whole lot. And also, I loved how challenging it was to try and find a way of drawing a wide-angle experience in a rectangle that seemed convincing. Now my sister kindly offered to go with me the following March to the Algarve, and she turned out to be the ideal painting assistant. She even laid out my palette for me in the morning, which saved a great deal of time. And we carried around a plastic crate for her to stand on so she could take the photographs from my height. Now this was really the way I carried on painting for the next few years. At a later time, my sister went with me to India for 3 weeks, and I painted in this way, getting subjects from Italy and other places. In 2002, my sight, I only had by this time a very little peripheral vision in my remaining left eye. And, well, there's all sorts of other stuff which I won't bore you with. Ways in which my iris wasn't functioning in the way yours does anymore. It wasn't enlarging and contracting according to the level of light. And there were all sorts of other strange things going on. But in 2002, my cornea had become so cloudy that it was decided that we would risk a corneal transplant operation, taking the healthy cornea from my blind right eye and stitching it onto my left eye. It was a risky operation, but it went very well. And this was the only time since 1980 that my sight had improved, and this was extremely exciting. The first thing I did was to repaint some of the pictures that I'd made the previous summer, and to carry on with this very large picture, 8-foot painting of my family upstairs in our house, which I had abandoned because I couldn't really see it. And then I started painting a lot of pictures of my wife Frances, who I could see again, which was lovely. And many of them were of her in a hammock down by the edge of the river. But this improved sight didn't really last very long. The new cornea began to cloud and ulcerate. In 2005, I went with my son Peter to Cadaqués on the Mediterranean in North Spain near Barcelona, which is a wonderful place of very narrow streets and lanes and steep flights of stairs and ramps tumbling down the hill, all surfaces painted blinding white, orange tiled roofs, and down at the bottom the deep Mediterranean Sea. It was my perfect subject really, I could hardly see anything at all. Peter went with me everywhere, necessarily, filming me and recording practically everything I said. And he helped me to find subjects, and when I found them, to understand them, and then eventually he took photo mosaics of the subjects for me. By this time I'd given up painting gouaches on the spot, and I made them on the veranda of our apartment. We went home for my birthday, just about this time of year, which was a perfect sunny day. The whole family were there. It was an absolutely wonderful, perfect birthday. But the next morning I woke up with a pain in my eye. And when Frances looked at it, she said, "My God, it's bleeding." And what had in fact happened is that one of the ulcers had perforated and the eye had in effect exploded. I thought at the time that this was probably what I'd been dreading, the end of sight, total blindness. And so it turned out to be. Now, just before I tell you what happened next, I want to say a little bit about my state of mind at the time, not at that moment in general, and my ideas about painting and art and the way I painted. When I went to Camberwell in 1960, I encountered there some very remarkable painters and teachers, people Graham was talking about, who influenced me very deeply. And I'm thinking in particular about Dick Lee, Ewan Uglow, and Frank Algarve. And then later, when I came back to do a postgraduate year, Francis Hoyland and Graham Giles. And these painters seemed to me to have something in common which excited me, which was that they all seemed to be answerable in some way to some aspect of the real physical world external to themselves, which they took as their subject, which they wanted to discover and experience as fully as they could and understand, and make some sort of pictorial metaphor for. They were all dedicated figurative painters, dedicated realists, who, for whom an idea of truth to experience seemed very important. And they didn't know how to do it. This was one of the things they needed to discover. They wanted to be surprised by their subject and surprised by their response to it. This last was most forcefully expressed by Algarve. And I found all of this very inspiring and exciting, and I knew that this was the sort of painting I wanted to engage in. And when I tried, I found that the world became more surprising and more beautiful than I had previously known it to be. And that alone was sufficient justification for working in this way. I wanted to find a subject which I could discover primarily through sight and try and paint. But two things were always unknown, had to be unknown. One was what my subject was. This is what I wanted to discover afresh each time. And the other was how, on that occasion, with the materials to hand, I could make the truest, the most expressive metaphor for it on a flat canvas. Now, I've gone into this at some length because this attitude to painting, which I had taken on, enabled me to go on painting through all the changes of sight that came about subsequently, and even, as it turned out, into blindness. If I had been the sort of painter who thought that perception was a fixed thing, that we all saw the same, and that there was a pre-existing true way of representing it on a flat canvas, then as my sight got worse and worse, as I saw less of the world and less of my canvas, I would simply have become too depressed to want to carry on. But for me, as long as I had an experience, and as long as I could organise materials on a canvas, the process was as viable as ever. As my sight got worse, it certainly did get worse, but the point was it was different. And that difference was something I had to try and understand and experience as fully as I could, and then find an equivalent for. And this was as challenging when I had very little sight as it had been when I'd had much more. And so it enabled me to keep going. Now then, how do you paint if you're blind? Well, obviously I can only tell you how I've done it. The first pictures I made...
Sorry, you've left out a chunk.
Which chunk have I left out?
The oil pastel.
What?
Oil pastel.
So I have, yes, yes. Now, the other... is this going to be tricky for you? Because
no, it's
the
fine.
sequence has gone
No, it's
on.
fine. No, it's fine.
Okay. There was another thing that was fortunate, and that was that I kept on finding that things that I had done in the past seemed to sort of surface to help me. In the 60s and early 70s, I made a lot of oil pastels. I liked it because it was a dry coloured medium, which you could sort of, carry about, a sketchbook and a tin of oil pastels in your pocket. And you could make an oil pastel anywhere. I would make them while waiting for a bus, or in the underground, or if I suddenly saw a sunset that was particularly marvellous, or a rainbow, or in somebody's sitting room. Anywhere. Now, if you want a colour that is different from the actual colour of the oil pastel itself, you have to get that by scribbling one colour over another. This sort of way of using oil pastels I went in for big time. And then, years later, when my sight became too bad for me to mix on a palette, I picked up individual pigments on a brush, more or less by feel, and brushed them over the colours on the palette, on the canvas, waiting for that place to give off the sensation I wanted it to. The only mixing I did on the palette was to mix white with one of the pigments if I was scumbling rather than glazing. And this sort of became my way of oil painting, which was really not unlike the way I'd used oil pastels. Now, I've already mentioned the matter of measuring and how in the early 90s, stuff to do with measuring that I'd learnt as a student in Camberwell came back to help me then. And measuring again became important when I started painting totally blind, but I'll say a bit more about that later. Excuse me. Before I went to art school, I spent 5 years studying engineering as an engineering apprentice. And when I finished, I wanted to read a maths degree, but for various reasons I didn't. I've got a sort of logical and reasonably mathematically trained mind, which likes to be exercised, and I suppose haven't been very much most of my painting life. But now, painting without seeing, the attempt to understand the three-dimensional space of my subjects and to project that understanding and to work out three-dimensional geometry and understand how that might turn into a two-dimensional geometry on the canvas is pretty taxing stuff, and that sort of keeps me, the sort of more mathematical part of my mind, quite exercised in a way which is good, I think. Okay, back to where I was, blind painting. Now, the first pictures I painted blind were the pictures of cateches, which were the last things I'd seen, though barely. But I tried to, well, I'd seen them and tried to paint them only a few weeks before. and my head was full of them and I wanted to paint them. And when I tried, something happened which seemed to, well, A, sort of keep my mind alive, and B, my family said was, you know, interesting and well worth doing. The problem actually was not so much colour, because I'd been painting with colour, as I've just been saying, jolly nearly blind for years. It was drawing. It was that problem again of knowing where the hell I was on the canvas and how to come back to the same place again. What I did to begin with was mark off key intervals from the edges of the canvas by putting elastic bands on brush handles. So I sort of hold the brush, you know, it was that far from the edge, and so I know that was where the edge of the wall came to, or whatever it was. And for bigger dimensions, I had elastic bands on my folding white stick. And I painted all the Calicaire subjects in this way, and then in, I think, the last one, the biggest, which was another one of these fairly standard sized canvases for me. It was to do with the width of a roll of canvas, but they're about 6'6" across. This painting, which I call Black Windows, there was a particular place which was very important, where the whole sort of space seemed to kind of spiral outwards or vortex outwards in the space, and I needed to keep on coming back to there, and it was quite a sort of large dimension from the right of the canvas and a not small one up from the bottom. And eventually I got so bored with measuring this again and again, and not having enough hands, because, you know, I've got a brush in one hand. And anyway, I stuck a lump of blue tack at that point on the canvas, so I could just find it, you know, by feel. And it seemed such an obvious thing to do, such a good idea once I'd done it, that by the end of that painting I had about 8 bits of blue tack in different positions. I painted the Calicaire subjects for over a year, I think, and while I was doing it, Peter was filming me at work, blind. It was a very sort of curious and lovely process. He was there, I couldn't see him, I didn't know where he was in the studio. He's very good at moving about silently. And, you know, we talked about things. And as Graham was saying, the result of this, the film that Peter made, both of our time together in Calicaires and then of me painting these subjects blind, is what's going to be shown on Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock in the Jubilee Hall. When I finished these subjects, the problem was now what to paint next. I didn't want to just paint again things I remembered. I didn't want to make stuff up. I've never wanted to make stuff up. And I spent a fair amount of uncomfortable time doing nothing. And then I thought, perhaps I can paint Frances again from very close too, so close that I can understand her pose by touch. So I asked her to sit in the armchair in the studio. I recommend an armchair in your studio. And I knelt on the floor so close to her that I could touch almost all of her. And as I began to understand how she was sitting by touch, something very interesting happened, which was that my brain began to construct a vision, an understanding, a sight of her in the chair from the position of my eyes. My brain was doing what it had spent the last 50 years or so doing. It just carried on doing it, even though the information was coming in by touch rather than by sight. And I started to mark this drawing off on a canvas with bits of blue tack. There was many, many more bits now. And then I also, because I couldn't reach the furthest bits of her on the chair, I started to use my white stick as a sort of solid ray of light. I held one end up to the bridge of my nose, and touch the other bit to where I wanted to know about, the side of her head or her shoulder or the side of her knees or wherever. And then I would move my solid light ray to another place, and I would estimate and measure the distance it had moved through and translate that into a relationship on the canvas, very much as I would have done when I could see. Now, it turned out, luckily, that I had a lot of canvases of exactly the right size for the subjects I was painting for this whole figure in an armchair at touching distance. Now, what I mean by that is that if I had looked through an empty stretcher at arm's length, what I could see through the window was the whole of Francis and the chair. And this meant that I could transfer measurements at fingertip distance directly from the subject onto my canvas, which worked pretty well. Now, after I painted 3 of these pictures, I came to 2 conclusions. One was that I wanted the chair to be laterally symmetrical in my canvas. That's to say, I decided that I always wanted to kneel at the centre of the chair, so that it had this symmetrical position in the canvas. And the other was, I haven't actually mentioned this, but in these first 3 pictures, I was painting, or I thought I was painting, things the colour that I knew them to be. I knew the chair was a sort of dark brown. I painted the carpet a sort of dirty green. The walls were white. There was bright grass through the window. Granny told me what colour clothes she was wearing, usually black, and there was colour for her flesh. I was sort of painting the light that I knew in the studio, but not really attending very much to that, since I couldn't see it. Anyway, the second conclusion I came to was that I didn't want to paint that chair brown anymore. I didn't like the colour of the chair very much. So I did what I'd done before when I could see and had painted Francis in this chair. I went to a cupboard where I kept dust sheets, and I was starting to put a white sheet over the chair when I thought, you silly bugger, you can't see it anyway. You can paint the chair any colour you like. And this was a great sort of turning point, really. And I started using colour in quite a different way from then onwards, much more intuitively, much more overtly decoratively than I ever had in my painting before. I would arrive at some understanding of the pose and some drawing of it with my probably about 50 bits of blue tack by then. And then I would sort of muse on the pose as I understood it and the image I was arriving at as I understood it, waiting for some sort of colour chord, some sort of colour harmony to suggest itself to me. This often happened while I was having a bath. It was something pretty simple, a colour for the chair, a colour for the background, a colour for the floor, a colour for Frances' clothes, a colour for her flesh. Nothing much more complicated than that. And I painted quite a lot of pictures in this way, different poses, and I enjoy doing this very much. Now, painting a whole figure from that close to is a pretty wide-angle view. I was looking pretty much across at the top of her head, and just about straight down at her toes on the ground. and the arms of the chair were quite a long way to left and right. Actually, I bought a new armchair, a better one. Also a much nicer colour, as it happens. It's a scarlet leather chair. I liked knowing it was that, even though I couldn't see it. But the main thing about it was that it had very wide, low, sort of sloping arms, which meant that Francis could more or less lie in it and take out all sorts of different positions. Where was I? Yes. Now, I mean, the fact that it was a wide-angle experience was fine by me, as I've been saying. I've been painting very wide views, wider than that, for years. There is an enormous problem to do with trying to project a pattern, to try and take a pattern from a curved surface and put it on a plane or flat surface. I mean, the simple fact is it can't be done. I can't really go into this much more now, it's too sort of complicated, but if you're interested in what I'm talking about, get hold of a globe of the world and compare what you see with maps in an atlas. Yeah, I'll have to leave it at that for the moment. Now, I did begin to worry after I painted really quite a lot of these pictures whether I might be just sort of starting to repeat myself, which I suppose is, or should be, always the worry of a creative artist. And I thought I might try to paint another catechese type subject. And I had stretched up one of my big 6x6 canvases. So I thought I'd try and sort of combine the two ways I painted blind. I sort of imagined a kind of cafe scene. I set up a little table in my studio and some chairs, and I got Frances to pose at touching distance for the figure on the left, and I got her to sit for the two girls at the table on the right, which I couldn't really touch, but I could with sticks, and I could go over and feel, and I got my son Michael to pose for the waiter. And then I sort of imagined the extended space and the Mediterranean light, which was based on catechese. And then I, well, did the best I could. Another starting point for this picture was wondering whether I could paint the standing figure's dress neat cadmium yellow and still have it looking as if it was in shadow. And for me, that sort of challenge where light in the subject and pigment colour on the surface of the canvas is concerned, that sort of challenge is rather like a sort of coloured equivalent of the challenge of trying to find a a believable, convincing, flat drawing for a wide-angle experience. I like things which seem impossible that you have to try and invent a solution to. I feel fully stretched when I'm trying to do that, and that's the way one needs to feel. Anyway, this was good. I enjoyed making this picture, and essentially that's what I've been doing since.
Landing.
What?
Landing.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Comes out. Setting up a subject of figures or a figure in a space either in the studio or somewhere in the house, and then imagining an extension of that. I painted quite a lot of pictures of Francis on our stairs and on the landing at the top of the stairs, because I could remember the light in the stairwell pretty well from having painted a number of pictures there when I could see after that corneal transplant operation. Now, this picture, which is the same size as the one with the girl in the yellow dress on the left, at the top of our stairs is what we call the little sitting room, which sort of opens off the landing. And I was sitting in the opening to that, imagining...
Sorry, have you forgotten the Bonnard?
Oh, I have, yes, I've just done a bit. Right, put all that on hold, I'll return to that. Now, when Franny was staying with a friend in France on one occasion, my friend painter Terry Rabel came to look after me, and he brought with him a novel about the painter Pierre Bonnard and his wife Marthe. Terry and I are both Bonnard experts and are in principle interested in anything to do with Bonnard. We fairly quickly gave up on the novel, but there was a very good description of a painting which we were pretty sure we recognised from the description. So Terry went off and got one of my books and found the painting. And we then started discussing the painting. It was pretty clear that Bonnard had been standing with his eye level above the top of Marthe's head. And we felt quite sure that he was close to her, probably no further than about 4 foot away. But the surprising thing was that there was no foreshortening through the standing figure. If you actually measure her, well, you can see that looking at the reproduction, which is what I hope you're doing now. But her crutch is halfway down from the top of her head to her feet. Now, as I'd been painting Francis standing from pretty close to, and using as little foreshortening as I thought I could believe in, I was very interested in the fact that Bonnard, while standing very close to her, had painted her with no foreshortening at all. So I thought I'd try and copy this picture. Luckily, I had a canvas that was just about the right proportion. And I knew the picture pretty well. And I got Terry, and then later Francis, to take measurements of the reproduction for me. And, you know, she would talk to me about how I was getting on, and I'd ask questions. And I also, in order to test out theories I had about how Bonnard was drawing, and also to identify more strongly with the subject, I made a plan and an elevation of the room and the objects in it with blobs of blue tack on sheets of hardboard. The sort of geometry involved in doing this is a bit too complicated to go into now. It's a bit like trying to solve a lot of simultaneous equations without enough equations. But I arrived at something which worked astonishingly well when translated into the pattern of the painting, and I thought confirmed a lot of the things I suspected about Bonnard's truth to his visual experience. So anyway, having done that, I thought, righto, well, I'll try and paint Francis from jolly close to standing without any foreshortening. And that was this painting. And then I did another one without any foreshortening here. And now we're back to that big picture that I started talking about earlier. Are we, friend?
Yeah.
Good show. Right, so, excuse me. I was imagining that our landing was the sort of veranda of a kind of bathing club somewhere on the Mediterranean, overlooking an infinity swimming pool. I've never seen an infinity swimming pool, but I love the idea of them. And my son, who has seen them, told me about them. and the Mediterranean, you know, far below. And I also realised that painting bathers was a very good wheeze because it was a bit like painting a group of nudes, which was something I'd never been able to believe in for myself. With the added advantage that you could make the swimsuits any bright colour you wanted. So I took to that. I wanted the two near-standing figures to be pretty well top to bottom of the canvas when they were at touching distance. And that determined that the width of the canvas would represent about 180 degrees from left to right, but that was fine by me, as I've been painting subjects as wide as that for years. But it was while I was making this picture that my sort of measuring techniques became sophisticated. I cut down a large cardboard tube, large diameter tube that my canvas came in, until it was the same height as Frances. And I marked various key intervals down it with blobs of blue tack. Her chin height, her shoulders, her bust, her waist, her crutch, her knees. And then I put this tube on a stand, attached it to a flat sheet, so that it could stand in for Frances when she wasn't available. And I could relate other places in the subject to it, and then find equivalent relationships on the canvas to the vertical, which was marked out on the canvas with equivalent blobs of blue tack down that vertical. I needed much longer canes to do this, and so I got some that were, I don't know, about 14 foot long or something. No, not as long as that. So I'd hold a cane out to some space in the stairwell, and then at fingertip distance. The problem with this is you need three arms, but I just about managed it. I would sort of measure across to see at what height that intersected the reference vertical, the cardboard tube. And then using a module, I would measure how many head heights it was across to the left, so that I could then plot that on the canvas. So this was a sort of measuring system that worked really pretty well. Now the next picture was even bigger because I wanted the standing figure, the reference figure, to be life-size. So at touching distance, you could call it my picture plane if you like, I could transfer measurements directly from the subject onto the canvas. And I also decided in this case that I would stand. In the previous one I'd been sitting. Now my station point for this painting is only about 2 foot away from that in the previous one. But I've turned 90 degrees to the left, so that the centre of this big picture is about the left-hand edge of the previous one. And the left-hand half of the new painting is the interior of the little sitting room. And as I said, I'm standing, not sitting. Now Frances posed for the 3 female figures, and the sitting one with her legs crossed might even be Frances. And my son Michael posed for the 2 male figures, though Terry also posed some of the time for the sitting figure on the left. The light in these paintings, unlike the light in the pictures of Frances in the chair, is directional light. But I was arriving at the colour on the canvas in a much more intuitive way than I had when I was painting directional light from observation. I wanted the foreground colours to be as light and as saturated as I could make them consistent with those spaces seeming to be in shadow compared with the blinding Mediterranean light beyond. Now the last picture I'm going to talk about is the next one coming up. I moved about 5 foot into the little sitting room and turned about 45 degrees to the right as compared with the previous picture, and I'm still standing. But here I've imagined a window in the wall of the little sitting room, which isn't there. And indeed, if there was one, I could simply see through into our bedroom. But I wanted to bring some sunlight through into the foreground space in this picture. And I also like the idea of sunlight hitting the back of the curtain, which was covering the left-hand half of the window, and therefore producing a very saturated sensation at that place, while having the lying down figure in shade. Now, if you try to paint a very wide-angle view with your eye level at the top of the canvas, top of the rectangle, and if you decide that your convention of drawing is that verticals in the subject, parallel verticals in the subject, will be parallel verticals on the surface of the canvas. What this means is that down at the bottom of the canvas, and particularly down at the bottom to left and right, you have hugely large areas compared with what we might call the shapes of appearance. If you don't understand at all what I'm talking about, I don't think I can take the time to go into it more than that. It's just this problem, really, of how to find a flat solution to the wide-angle experience, but it's particularly exacerbated for those two reasons. You can probably see that the lying down figure on the left was much higher up the canvas at one point, which is much more where, according to my sort of convention of measuring, it should be. But these techniques of measuring were never things I felt answerable to. They were simply something that helped me to get going. The challenge is always to find a drawing which feels right, which feels inevitable in the rectangle, but which is also part of an overall drawing which generates a believable space and light. And one has to keep going until one's done the best one can in that respect. That figure had to be down in the left-hand corner in order to feel right, whatever my understanding of perspective through measurement was telling me. I don't know whether I know what my pictures look like or not. I think I do. And luckily, a lot of people seem to like them. Well, there we are. That's the end. But I'm delighted to try and field some questions.
Sargy, it's a big question. If I take something like that last canvas, how long does it take to produce, say, the last one that we saw there?
I can't be sure. I think I was working on it for about 6 months. Something like that. I used to be able to work on more than one picture at a time. I don't seem to be able to do that now, or I wish I could. I'd like to have more than one picture going, but the last few big ones I am painting more slowly now than I was, which is a shame, but there it is.
I was interested that you use gouache when you
Oh, yeah.
What? This is another stupid question, as they're all bound to be. What kind of size would your gouache pictures be when you do them?
Well, when I started, I can't remember quite why it happened. For some reason, it was, yes, I think I can remember. When I was painting oils and drawing all over them with pencil and sort of graphite sticks, that sort of having almost like kind of, well, I suppose it was like drawing, or anyway like pen and wash drawing, which is not something I've done a great deal of, but which I've spent a lot of time looking at and thinking about. I mean, Rembrandt drawings have always been a massive influence on me, and drawings too. And the language of pen and wash was something which interested me very much indeed. I'd better try and shut up quickly, otherwise this will go on for another half hour or so. But I think the thing is that oil pastels, I don't think I've been making oil pastels for ages. I don't know why, but I just stopped doing it. But I found that with gouache, because it dried quickly, I could sort of then sort of scribble over them with pencil in the same sort of way. So it felt like the way I was using oil paint. And I think I started doing that to begin with just in a sketchbook, 8 by 10 sketchbook. And then I spent a few years, a couple of years or so, making imperial-sized gouaches. I found that I like using Arches Satiné paper, not absorbent paper at all.
Great.
Right, that's enough on that.
There we are. Sargy, it's Michael Robinson. You've talked quite a bit about this issue, the mathematical issues of projection of the picture, with projection onto a flat surface. And I know that in your youth you were very interested in, as it were, the absolute peripheries of vision, something that also Bonnard, you showed me, I remember, that Bonnard likes to show himself on the edge of the painting. And I wondered whether you talked to us in these recent paintings, which incidentally are wonderful, about where you're standing.
Yes.
And I just wondered whether you ever thought of trying to show yourself painting.
Well, do you know, curiously, I didn't mention this because, well, frankly, because I'd forgotten it, but I am actually in one of those paintings, sort of. That picture called Black Windows,
Yes, I thought that was
that figure in the foreground is me. And I don't know, can you find it, Fran, or not?
No.
No. All done. And for ages, I didn't have that figure in the painting at all. It was never in the original idea. But there were things to do with resolving the space of that picture, which I mean, the trouble is I'm now trying to remember painting it, and but anyway, there was a time when I sort of, I mean, it doesn't work because obviously that figure isn't in quite the right place. It's, you know, I'm here and that figure's there. In fact, probably, as it turns out, just about at the distance that the standing figures are in the more recent, you know, just about at touching distance in front of me. That's probably where that figure is. But in a narrative sense, it was me. So, yeah, and it is something I've thought about from time to time. On one of the big pictures I was painting in the 90s, I used to paint them. I said that I needed direct sunlight to paint those pictures, and I had things that Graham called goalposts, which were like a sort of permanent easel, up in the garden where I used to carry these canvases out and attach them. And what I would do from time to time was get right away from the picture and try to see something a bit more like the whole picture through the monocular. And on one occasion I set the picture up and I moved back and looked through the monocular and I thought, oh my God, that's wonderful. And what I saw was my own shadow, huge across the canvas, looking unbelievably beautiful. Please don't misunderstand. And it did occur to me that if I got Frances to come and draw around the edge, and possibly, because she's got such a fantastic eye, she could have done this. We might do this, you know, it's still a possibility. She could sort of match the colours of the shadow so that one could paint that on. I mean, I don't think if you did it, it would look like a shadow. I think there is just something different about that real change of light. But I'd like to know, of course I never would know now, I'd have to rely on what somebody else told me. But I'm a very, in a way, cautious artist. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I'm not better than I am. I've never been very adventurous or brave, and somehow it struck me as a very exciting idea, but I didn't do it. And I wish I had now. Any more?
I've got a question.
No, not yet. Let's take a couple more, I think, and then we must let Sargy stop. So, you've been asking for some time.
I just wanted to ask you, I have some reproductions of some of your paintings up in my studio, which I look at a great deal, and just huge pleasure looking at the new stuff you've done. You have there's a wonderful geometry about your paintings, of the weights of the canvas and where the intensities are and where there are diagonals and things, that recurs again and again. And I mean, it's right from the beginning in your work, and I just wonder how much, you know, where this, if you want to see where it comes from. And does that mean anything to you if I say that? It just has.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and it sounds very nice. I suppose it's not something. I mean, of course, I think about. Well, I think about drawing. I've always tried to avoid the word composition because it's just an aspect of drawing, and I don't like separating it off as if it's some sort of different kind of drawing. And in my teaching, I hardly ever use the word composition for that reason. But what it means, of course, is something I'm thinking about. You have to. I don't think any conscious sort of compositional recipes, which well, that's not true, of course I did, I'm sure to have.
It doesn't read as a recipe to me so much as it's such a sort of pleasurable balance that you arrive at.
But in a way, what you're talking about, I think, is simply well, it's more what I would want to mean by style. I mean, you know, if you think of, say, a landscape by Seurat, I mean, there is, you know, we're talking about, you know, giants now, but they're all different. But as soon as you start in your imagination or in front of you comparing them with, say, a Soutine, there are important ways in which you could say all the surahs are the same, and all the sutins are the same, in that sutins are like sutins and not remotely like surahs, and vice versa. Now, I think that's just the artistic personality of the artist. And I don't think myself, this is very important to me that I believe this, I don't think it's just to do with ideas about composition or decoration. I think it's also to do absolutely with how they experience the world. And I think if you're the sort of figurative painter that I care about, those two things are totally interwoven. And that your experience of the world, your experience of your subject is arrived at through painting, and your painting is arrived at through your experience of the subject. And what we have here is a sort of positive feedback mechanism. And that's the beauty of it all.
Thank you.
Should we have one last? There we go, there's a hand raised.
Yes, it's Alice Eastaugh. One thing that really impressed me is your memory and the visual memory, and you're not being a painter. I find that completely blows me away, really. And your figures, especially in the paintings since you have been blind, just seem so real and so vital. I suppose I wanted to ask you whether you felt your memory had improved, and other areas of memory as well, not just visual memory, and whether it's something that you've kind of worked
It's
out.
hard to answer that, Alice. What I'm aware of is how bad my memory is. But then so was Bonnard, you see. I mean, he painted, as you may know, entirely from memory, almost always. And seems to us to have had the most staggering visual memory, almost inconceivable. But he apparently, his great nephew told me, was terrified of forgetting. That was, he was just spent the whole time thinking his memory was rubbish and he'd forget. People say my visual memory is good. I don't feel it is. I'm appalled at how badly and embarrassed, people, I think of pictures I ought to know jolly well, I think from the National Gallery, and I can't remember if the figures on the left or the right and stuff like that. As to have my memory improved since going blind, I guess in some ways, yes, it will have done. I think I have a sort of tactile memory now, which I had no particular need for before, or maybe yes, that, and I suppose because that's my input, in my paintings. You see, it's not, when I'm painting, I do see the pictures. Quite what I mean by that is very hard even for me to understand, let alone to explain to you. But I do see them. But then, it's funny, I know I left out a bit, and I'm going to say it now quickly, because I realise I've said very, very little about how I use colour now that I'm blind. And I know that most people find that probably the most surprising thing and the hardest thing to understand. And I can't really say a great deal about this, but when composers are writing arrangements, they write them down on manuscript paper, or a lot of them do. They don't have a symphony orchestra in their study. They know what an oboe sounds like, they know how it's different from a clarinet, they know what horns sound like against strings. All these sounds are distinct and clear in their memory, both individually and in combination. And they can conjure these memories and play with them and change the chords and arrive at what they want. Now, it's kind of a bit like that with me in colour. I do need to check with Francis quite a lot that I've done what I mean to do. And as the paintings go on, and I change my idea about colour harmonies, Francis mixes up more colours for me. But, you know, that's on the basis of conversations we've had, questions I've asked her. Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much.
Sargy, that was absolutely extraordinary and wonderful. And inspirational to see this unadventurous painter who's only painting some of the most beautiful paintings while being totally blind. It's one of my memories, which will be, I'm sure, a long memory of this evening, is just how beautiful the pictures are as they come. That last painting, it looks absolutely stunning. So, Sargy, thank you very, very much indeed for sharing the fascinating workings of how you come about it, and go on being an unadventurous, please.